This is our first class in 2024, lesson 30. And I don't know how soon we'll finish the material, but we have a fair amount more material to cover. This is lesson number 30 in the series on biblical hermeneutics. Biblical hermeneutics, of course, is how we interpret the Bible. And we'll be looking at follow-up to the last lesson in December of 2023, social customs in hermeneutics. We looked at social customs and we classified them into three categories. There are some social customs that are good. If it's a good social custom, then we need to be following it as Christians. And if we have a social custom that's evil, we should never follow it. And if it's a neutral social custom, there will be three categories. Then we should examine it and see if it will either hinder or help the cause of Christ. If it hinders the cause of Christ, then we should not do it. If it would help the cause of Christ, then we should do it. If it's a toss-up, then it's kind of a toss-up whether we'll do it or not. But most of the time, we'll be able to look at it and see if it'll hinder or harm the cause of Christ or aid it. Does someone have a question? The Jews in Exodus 23:19 were not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now, the word kid is translated from the same word that's translated lamb. It could be a baby goat or a baby sheep. And for to offer one of the sacrifices was to be a kid in the sheep or the goats. So it would be a young sheep or a young goat. Don't boil it in its mother's milk. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what is that all about? Well, several acts are associated with idolatry. This might mute your mic. That'll take care of it. Okay. Some acts are associated with idolatry. Acts are associated with false religion. Okay. Be sure your mic is muted. There'll be an arrow over the microphone on your computer there. All right. A little line drawn over it. Some acts are associated with idolatry, some are with false religion, which would make them wrong. And we'll look at the instructions of Exodus 23:19. They were not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. And that probably was associated with idolatry. We can't be certain of that, but they were forbidden to do it. And some claimed that it would be almost like being sacrilege to use its mother's milk to boil or to cook the baby, her baby. And so that is one reason some think that was a custom or a prohibition, actually. And the instructions in 1 Corinthians 14:33b through 34, are they merely social custom for the first century only? That's a good question. We're going to look at that. But let's look at it. Exodus 23:19. The first of the first fruits of thy ground thou shalt bring into the house of the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So they weren't to boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now, we think of a kid in the United States, a goat is, baby goat's called a kid and a baby sheep's called a lamb. But the Hebrew would cover both. And so the kid would be a term used for either a lamb or a baby goat, but you're not to boil it in its mother's milk. Some commentators read commentaries on this, Keel and Dietlich particularly, I believe, claim this is related to idolatry. Of course, this would make this an evil custom if it were related to idolatry. Keel and Dietlich state the actual references to cooking of a kid in the milk of its own mother as indicating contempt for the relation which God has established and sanctified between parent and young, thus subverting the divine ordinances. This is what they state it is. They think it's just contrary to what you would normally think. You wouldn't do that. And so that's, but other commentators think it was related to idolatry. Okay? Either way, it was forbidden to them, and that, I believe they understood what it was about. In Leviticus 19:27, there's some acts that are associated with idolatry. He shall not round the corners of your heads, neither shalt thou mar the corners of thy beard. So they were not to cut the hair in certain ways. There were certain ways that the hair was cut, and this linked them with something that was idolatrous. The Keel and Dietlich again, there's somewhat of a scholarly commentary on the Old Testament. You should not round the border of your head, i.e., not cut the hair in a circle from one temple to the other, as some of the Arab tribes did, according to Herodotus. Herodotus talked about this, and he says in Herodotus 3:8, in honor of their god Orato, whom he identifies as Dionysus of the Greeks. So they would cut that in a circle from one temple to the other temple, as some of the Arab tribes did. Herodotus talked about this. Herodotus is probably the first known historian who actually did pretty decent historical research. And, he was a Greek, and he was about 200 or 300 BC when he wrote this. And you can get Herodotus's works on the internet and find them on the internet. And we have a copy in the library here at the church for our school library. We have a copy of Herodotus. Leviticus 19:28, and this is probably related to idolatry. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord, I am Jehovah, I am Yahweh. Here, this would be the cuttings of your flesh for the dead. We know that some societies, when a person dies, they will cut their body and bleed in order to show their grief over the death of their loved one. Or they would print marks upon themselves. That's basically tattoos, or these would be like a tattoo. And this right here, nor print any marks upon you. This appeared to be associated with idolatry. And again, another custom was to disfigure their bodies when the relative died. It might have been associated with idolatry. Another possibility is they were to show proper reverence for God's creation, not to disfigure it. This is one idea that some have, that's what that's referring to. This would make it an eternal principle if that would be true, not to disfigure our body on purpose. Now, if my body gets disfigured by an accident, that's not a sin. But if I do it on purpose, the claim is by some that would be a sin. This is a hard one to call on this one. But disfiguring our bodies when a relative died, it appears that that's what it's talking about. Make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead. I think that's what it, or print any marks upon you. I think that was for the dead. So they would put it for the dead. Any comments or questions? Jehovah's Witnesses do not have birthday parties because it's supposedly linked with idolatry. But I haven't seen the link. But there's no evidence that 21st century America links birthday parties with idolatry. Now, we could go back, if we went back far enough, even the days of the week. Like Thursday is Thor's Day, and the days, most of the days of the week are named after some idol. But most of modern day people in our country that speak English in the United States do not relate Thursday, the day we call Thursday, with the god Thor, nor Saturday with Saturn, the god Saturn. So I would argue then that this evidence regarding these parties, having birthday parties and naming our days as they're named and using those names for those days, I don't see anything wrong with that. Any comments or questions? Now, here's an act that could be related to false religion. If a woman wore a nun's habit, that's a Roman Catholic nun, the clothing she wears, she would not be able to influence people to obey the gospel because they'd link her with a false religion. So I don't think we should be wearing those. Or if a gospel preacher wore a backwards collar, well, I don't know what the term for that is. I've never heard them give a name for it. But it's a collar that goes around backwards and it ties in the back. And a lot of clergymen supposedly wear these. And I don't believe they'd be able to influence people to obey the gospel. They would get a wrong impression about what the church teaches and practices. So if we engage in actions that are either linked in the minds of people with false religion or with wicked practices, that would be sinful. Now, I've heard some say, well, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons go from door to door knocking doors to try to get converts. Well, that is, while it may be linked with these people, it's not necessarily wrong because they do it. And I don't think we'd be wrong to use that practice to try to get converts. It's a long shot. We don't get a lot of converts that way. But if we get one or two, it's worth it. And we might get studies and get some converts that way. But just because they do it doesn't make it wrong. All right. Look at 1 Corinthians 14:33b. I believe that verse 33 is properly divided by the American Standard Version. And the last half of verse 33, I call it B, as in all the churches of the saints, that the women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted of them to speak, but let them be in subjection, as also saith the law. The law would be the law of Moses. So they were to be in silence. Now, here's a question we have to ask. When we talk about silence, what words are employed for silence? Now, this passage, I devote a lengthy portion of my book on the role of women, particularly, and you can go in the Scripture Index and find where I discuss it in great detail. But the silence is permitted; they're not permitted them to speak. There's two words for silence. Sigao is to not speak anything, not say a word. And hesychio, hesychazo, the verb, hesychia is the noun form of it. This word would be silence in the sense that you don't get out of your place. You take the position that you've been given and live with it. Now, let me illustrate this. When I was in the military, the officers over me had authority over me. And I knew I had a certain position, and I was not to get out of my role that I was assigned to. You learn that right quick in boot camp or in as I did in Officer Candidate School. So you have to have, and there has to be a role or a position. The word hesukazo or hesukia noun form is having a certain assigned role and living under that role or that position that you've been assigned. Whereas sigao is to not say anything. So right here, they're to keep silence in the churches and not permit them to speak. And the word speak here is in the, it is a present tense, a present tense infinitive. And what this means for us is, and I documented in my Role of Women book, so you can get a lot more discussion on this in that book. Just go to the index, scripture index, and find the passages, the pages where it's found. But this is a present tense infinitive, which means it's to be the speaker. Most of the time, the Greek language loves the aorist tense, which does not necessarily give us continuous or durative action. So when it uses the present tense, it's going to be a durative or continuous action. So when it says to speak using that present tense in the Greek, it's really saying not to be the speaker. So she is not permitted to be a speaker in the assembly of the church. And so he says that let them be in subjection. So by being the speaker, she's not in subjection, as also saith the law of Moses. So by the fact that it's the law of Moses said this, it's telling us that this is an eternal principle. Any questions or comments? Now let's look at some principles that we developed in the prior lessons, the last lesson of last year of this lesson. Social customs should never be followed when they're evil. Social customs should be violated when they hinder the advancement of the gospel. Social customs should be followed when they're either neutral or good. Go along with them if they're neutral, if they don't have any positive or negative effect on Christianity, upon serving God, then just go ahead and do them. But if they're neutral or good, for instance, I was told, and I believe there's some evidence that this is the case, that in Mexico, that the oldest son takes care of mom and daddy when they get old. And they're respected and honored for it, and the society looks upon them as being a good son when they do this, and they're highly respected for it. Now, if that's true, and I believe it is true, then that would be a good custom to follow. And if you were a younger child and you perhaps had the money, you could help that older one to do some of the caring for mom and daddy, give them some help. That would be good to do. Might not be required, but it certainly would be the right thing to do to help out with that person. Now, under the law of Moses and under the patriarchal law, they would receive, the oldest son would receive a double portion of inheritance. So if there were two sons, the inheritance would be divided into three parts, and the oldest son would get 2 parts. He'd get 2/3 of it, and the remaining 1/3 would go to the second son, the younger son. If they had 3 sons, they divided into 4 parts, and the older would get 2 parts, and the other 2 would get 1 part each, 1/4 each, and that's how they would work it. And of course, if we look at how it was set up, the oldest one was to care for the parents. The custom in Mexico, as I've been explained to me, I believe is probably maybe a spinoff from the Bible itself. It's possible. Any questions or comments? All right. 1 Corinthians 14:33 and 34 cannot merely be a social custom, because it's to be violated only if it hinders the cause of Christ or is sinful. Now, let me point this out. The prohibition of women from preaching, in this case to be a speaker speaking, would hinder the cause of Christ if it reduced the number of preachers by 50%. That would hinder the cause of Christ. So the fact that he tells them not to be a speaker tells me that this is not a custom. Because if it were a custom, he'd go ahead and violate it. And we saw in our last lesson that Jesus violated custom in order to advance the gospel. And of course, if we could double the number of preachers legitimately and please God in doing it, that would be a good thing. But the scriptures tell us that the women are not to be speakers. So this reduces the number of possible persons who could preach to only men. And that would be roughly 1/2 of the congregation have that potential ability to preach, to be preachers and or teachers. So this proves that it's not a custom by virtue of this point here that we have. So it would imply then that this is a principle, an everlasting principle. It's a principle that's given in the law of Moses, and therefore it's also in the New Testament. Now, I believe we can establish also that it's in the patriarchal system as well. All three systems, it's in those systems. Any comments or questions? Since God would not allow a reduction in the number of preachers by 50%, it's evidence, not a matter of custom. This has to be an eternal principle, as set forth in verse 34, as also saith the law. So he says the law of Moses says this. Now, when he says the law, many times he'll go back even to the patriarchal law, because as he quotes from things like creation, for example, that gets back to the patriarchal law. So this tells me it goes back even further, even than Mount Sinai. This eternal principle that the woman keeps silence in the churches, where it's not permitted unto them to speak, to be a speaker. See, that's a present tense infinitive, which was not normal. Most of the time, your infinitives are aorist tenses. And so the present tense, every time they use it, the purpose is to indicate durative or continuous action, to be a speaker in this case, but let them be in subjection. By being a speaker in the assembly, a woman is not in subjection. And so that's what he's saying here by the word but. But I lay this out in my Roll of Women book in more detail. Other questions? We need to have a background information on the social customs of Bible times. So as we're studying the Bible, we need to study more carefully about social customs in Bible times. Sometimes we can read the writings of people of that time frame, such as Josephus and others. They may give us some information about what people did. Josephus gives us some information. For instance, if you want to know more about the Pharisees and Sadducees, Josephus was a Pharisee, and he'll tell you more about what they believed. But they had several things that they believed. They believed in angels, they believed in spirits, and they believed in a resurrection. And but they believed also in the traditions of the elders. The elders' traditions were binding upon them, and so they bound them. And Jesus never had trouble with them when they were teaching the law of Moses correctly, but he did have trouble with them when they were binding traditions upon people. And so that's where Jesus had trouble with them most of the time. Now, they had misinterpretations of the law of Moses, and he had to correct some of them. But the Pharisees, then, always remember it this way: they're fair, you see, because they believe there's a resurrection. But the Sadducees, and when I talk to children, I would teach them this, they're sad, you see, because they don't believe there'll be a resurrection. When you die, you're like the little dog Rover. When you're dead all over. So the Sadducees, if you understand them, what they taught, then you'll see how Jesus dealt with them. Now then, here's another point that you can get from Josephus and from some other sources of the first and second century. And this is this, that the Sadducees also only accepted because they considered anything after Deuteronomy, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those first 5 books. Anything after Deuteronomy, including Joshua onward, they considered them to be tradition. And so they took the law of Moses. They would only appeal to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's all they appealed to. So if you'll notice when Jesus deals with them, whenever he answers their arguments or their claims, he always goes to the Pentateuch to answer their claims, their problems. Every time he goes to the Pentateuch, because they didn't accept the other books. Now, they were wrong not to accept the other books, but Jesus took what they believed and used it to show the truth to them. Begin with that. So the role of women in the assemblies of the church were not customs, but they're eternal truths. Right? Some matters are alleged to be customs, but in fact they're not social customs. And the role of women is one of these that is. 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through the end of the chapter, has some things that some think are customs, but they're not, because they have to do with the man being created first. And it's primogeniture principle. The Greek temples, women were allowed to speak, but not in the Lord's church. This is in the social custom of the first century. In the Greek temples, women were allowed to speak and get up and give an oration, but not in the Lord's church, say. So in society as a whole, women were allowed to speak. Social custom allowed women to speak, but the scriptures prohibited their speaking. So this tells me this is not a custom. Custom was women speak, but the church, the Lord didn't allow women to be speakers in the assembly of the Lord's church. Now, I would argue if we had a situation where there were no men present in the assembly, I would argue that the women could have all 5 acts of worship, and they could preach and teach, lead singing, and distribute the Lord's Supper, lead prayer, and all that, do all of it. That was my assertion. I'm convinced that that's true. However, if a man entered the assembly, he'd have to take over and do all of it. Right? The Jewish custom related to separation of men and women in the assembly of the synagogue. Now, they separated them. The women and the men didn't sit together. If the church exists in a society that segregated men and women in this manner, it should have the assemblies in a segregated fashion. And when I went to Ghana, the women sat on one side of the assembly and the men on the other. And when I was facing them and speaking to them, to my left, on all the pews were women and children. On the right side of the pews were men. The man didn't sit with his wife and children. He sat back with the men. Now, that's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But that was their custom. So I believe it would not be wrong to follow that custom if that was the custom they followed. Questions or comments? The custom of wearing a veil by women should be followed by Christian women if it's the social custom of that society, if that's their social custom. Why would we want to do that? If you went to Ireland, for example, to preach and teach, the women in Ireland wear something on their head when they go into worship. This is due to the Roman Catholic influence, but there's no sin in putting something on the head during the worship. No sin involved in it. It's not sinful. And if you don't do it, they're going to look at you like you're a rebellious person because you didn't follow that custom. And then you can't get an audience with them to teach them the gospel. Any questions or comments? I believe that it's a custom. And in that case, if it were the custom of the land, we would just follow it and go ahead and follow that custom. In Ireland, I had a friend that was from Ireland, and he told me that a woman didn't wear makeup. They didn't wear makeup in the assembly. The women didn't wear makeup because only the bad women would wear makeup. So wearing lipstick and makeup was actually something that they shouldn't do. He said a preacher's wife that he knew of, they moved there, and his wife was wearing makeup, and none of the other women were, and they had to have a talk with her. Okay. Again, that's a custom. And if it's a custom, don't fight it. Just let it go. I don't believe it's wrong to wear makeup, but I'm saying in that society, it probably would be wrong because you could be a stumbling block to those people. Any question? We should conform to customs in order to be able to influence people to obey the gospel. That gospel preacher's wife, I believe, put wearing makeup to the assembly. She quit wearing makeup. She just quit it. And that way she could have a better influence upon the other people or the other women around her that would listen to her. Whereas if she was wearing makeup, she was considered to be a bad woman. Only the evil women would wear makeup. I've known some religious groups, some Assembly of God and Pentecostal type groups when I was younger that didn't wear makeup. The girls didn't wear makeup. We must always conform to morally good customs. We must never conform to morally evil customs and consider the effects of a neutral custom. I believe wearing makeup is a neutral custom. Whether they wear it or don't wear it is irrelevant. And a woman that doesn't have makeup on is not doing wrong. And I don't believe if society wouldn't have a custom against it, wearing makeup wouldn't be wrong. Wouldn't be wrong to wear makeup. We need to teach new converts about the distinction between customs in order that they might make the right decisions in these matters. That's important. You should know the difference between customs of men and the law of God. There's a difference. Know that their love for lost souls will cause them to give up their liberty. I believe this gospel preacher's wife had the liberty to wear makeup, but because she wanted to not be a stumbling block, she quit wearing makeup in order to be able to have an influence upon the women of in this case, Ireland. Any questions, comments? And so her love said, I'll give up that liberty so I can convert. Love for our neighbor is the second most important commandment in all of God's word. And so if I love my neighbor, as this Christian gospel preacher's wife did, she'd just quit wearing the makeup. And she would put some on her head in the assembly. Jesus was asked a question, teacher or master. Now, when it says master, it's really most of the time referring to a schoolmaster. It's a British term. Master, schoolmaster, or teacher, American Standard reads, which is the great commandment in the law of Moses. And he said unto him, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the great and first commandment. So Jesus answered the question for him, and then he added to it. And the second like unto it is this. So it's just like it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Then he said, on these two commandments, the whole law hangeth in the prophets. I think of it like a picture hanging on the wall. You have maybe a cord or a little wire on the back of the picture frame, and it hangs over a nail. And so it hangs on these two commandments. So I think of it that way. I'm not sure that that's what Jesus meant here, but that's how I view it. And so there's two commandments that are the basis for all of the law of God. And if you put all of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, into these two areas, there's some of them that primarily relate to our relationship to other people. That's love our neighbor as ourselves. And there's some that relate to our relationship to God. And so that would be primarily love of God. Then there's some that kind of overlap into both. Now, I really believe that whenever he says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder, really better translated, it relates to both man and God, because God created, you're destroying God's creation. He created something in his own image. And so we're not permitted, without God's permission, to take the life of that person. Not permitted to do that. Now, we can do it as an act of punishment for capital crimes. So someone murders somebody or does some other crime that the law would allow them to be put to death. But these two commandments here, the whole law hangs on these. So all of God's law is hanging upon these. I was told of a wise Jew who was approached by a pagan neighbor, and this neighbor says, "Tell me about your law, the law of your God, and stand on one foot when you tell me." So this wise old Jew who stood on one foot, he says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all the heart, soul, and mind. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." All the rest of it's just commentary on that to tell you how to do those two things. And he stood on 2 feet as soon as he got through saying that. That was pretty good. I believe that's he was a wise person. This may not be a true story, but it sure makes the point clear. And what love causes us to do, our love for God causes us to put spiritual things first. And our neighbor causes us to give up our liberty for the sake of the salvation of our neighbor. So we put these 3 areas of customs that are always good, we're just going to do them because it's the right thing to do. Evil, we'd never do it because God won't be pleased with it. And if it's neutral, we ask ourselves, does it help the cause of Christ? If it does, I'll do it. If it hurts, hinders the cause of Christ, I won't do it. And if it's neither going to harm nor hinder, I'll just go ahead and do it. And that way I won't be people looking at me like I'm weird or strange or rebellious of society. It probably would help my influence upon the people around me. Liberty in neutral matters is not as important as the salvation of a soul. And so a woman will cover her head in Ireland or Italy or places like that in order to just conform to the customs. If I were in a society where all the men wore a beard, I'd let my beard grow. I've had a beard in the past, and I like a beard. They don't have to shave every day. Just take clippers, clip it about once a week, and that'll work pretty well. But our liberty in neutral matters is not as important as salvation of a soul. So we just conform to whatever they have and follow through. There are several passages of scripture that are regulations that are based upon customs. There are several passages, and I would give you 1 Corinthians 8, Romans 14, and of course, then we have some in 1 Corinthians 11 and some in 1 Corinthians 14. Some other passages that would probably fit in there as well. Customs that are linked with false religion, including idolatry, should not be followed by Christians at all, ever. Don't do anything that's linked with false religion. Customs that are inherently good, we should follow these customs. And again, I gave the example of Mexico, people from Mexico, the older son taking care of his parents, and the younger children, I think if they're what they ought to be, will provide some help to the older child, or at least offer it to him. If he turns it down, then that's his decision. But I think it would be good to help bring food and other stuff and bring some clothing for gifts to the parents and so forth. Customs which are inherently evil. I used, back in December, I used the illustration of some of the Eskimos, I was told, would leave their parents when they got too old to be careful and out on the ice where the polar bears to eat. And that's an evil custom. That would be very evil. I should never follow these customs. We're getting almost to that in the United States where the euthanasia is being encouraged. And so that's being practiced in some states. It's legal in some states now. Customs which are inherently neutral, we should examine the effects of the custom and follow them as much as possible in order to be able to influence people to obey the gospel. So that's what we need to do. Questions? Anybody? All right.